Welcome to Co-Opinions. My name is Josh, and today I have Jake with me.
You just can't get rid of me.
I really can't. And today we are going to talk about our third episode of Zelda, which in this one we're going to touch on quite a few portable games. However, some of them can be lumped together, and because another bit of them were early Game Boy, they're pretty brief. Before we get into that, I want to talk about some of the games I'm currently playing, because I'm not doing much because, as one of my coworkers pointed out, I've brought this up 1,000 times, but I'm studying for that certification, so I'm not trying to focus too heavily on stuff. I'm currently playing Dead Rising 4. I gotta say, I'm not super impressed. They keep removing what I consider to be the heart of the series. In this particular one, they have gutted it even more because now it doesn't even have a time limit. And in the first, second, and third games, your psychopaths all had some bit of personality, the bosses you fought. They don't even have that anymore. Like, you just fight harder enemies. It's kind of a bummer. It doesn't have me real stoked for the fifth game when they inevitably make it, but I got it as a gift, so whatever. We'll just go ahead and launch into the Zelda games, however. And the first one we're going to talk about is Link's Awakening. Now, Link's Awakening was originally on Game Boy. It got re-released as Link's Awakening DX when the Game Boy Color came out, which included an extra color-centric dungeon. But I have played this game so many times, it's almost hilarious. Jake actually asked right before this episode started, he goes, "When's the last time you played that? We're not going to cover this for very long." A year and a half ago. What? This is a game that I have beaten so many times that I can navigate. I could tell you how many screens to move to get to individual objectives. Like, I'm really into this game.
Now, to be fair, it is a fantastic game.
Oh, it's so good.
Especially considering the fact that it's on the original Game Boy.
Mhm.
So, very limited, both in color palette and how much room you have in the game to move around.
But the game, if we're looking at it chronologically, on the timelines, takes place after the Oracle game. So after Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages, this game canonically happens. It came out in release schedule as the one after Link to the Past, which is why you can see a ton of influence from Link to the Past on this game, which is something we're going to talk about as we go through the episode.
Even though chronologically they happen after this game.
Correct.
Thanks, Nintendo.
Yeah, no, not confusing. Anyways, you're sailing on a ship, terrible wreck, and you wake up on Koholint Island. I only ever read it as a child, so
yeah.
I've never had to pronounce it.
That's how I always pronounced it too, was Koholint Island.
So a Zelda XP finds you named Marin. You wake up and you're going through contrivance. You end up stumbling upon the first dungeon. I'm going to blitz through this story, even though I could basically almost tell you the text they say. And in the process, you find out that something's not quite right with this island. And as you continue to progress, you interact with a lot of really memorable characters to me. For example, after you beat the first dungeon, you go back to the main town, and somebody's dog has been kidnapped. So you have to go and rescue a dog. And the dog is a chain chomp, is Bow Wow. It's just a chain chomp.
So, an aside to that, real quick, is this game, even though it's on the original Game Boy, actually started as a port of Link to the Past on the Game Boy. And it was being worked on after hours by programmers there as just kind of an aside project. And eventually they ran into some limitations with the hardware because a Game Boy is nothing close to as powerful as a Super Nintendo. So they basically ended up making it its own game. But because of the weird nature of kind of how it started, there is a bunch of characters from other Nintendo games in this game, like the aforementioned Chomp.
There's also Mr. Right from SimCity as a character.
Yes.
Because, and I could be way off base on this one, was there a Zelda game before this? There were only 3 Zelda games before this. This did the first trade quest. Correct me if I'm wrong there.
I believe that's correct.
So, and okay, I'm going to see if I can get through this decently fast. You get the Yoshi doll from the Crane game. You give the Yoshi doll to one of the kids who gives you a bow. You give the bow to Madame Bow Wow, who gives you dog food. You give the dog food to a crocodile, a talking crocodile, who gives you bananas. No, yes, who gives you bananas. You give the bananas to a monkey. This is where it's interesting because the quest is actually crucial to continuing the game. You can't continue on in the game until you've given the monkey these bananas. The monkey then leaves behind a stick who you give to a dude who knocks a hornet's nest out of a tree. The hornet's nest you then give to a bear who gives you a pie. No, I'm starting to mix it together. What does the bear give you? Does he give you hibiscus? Oh, I'm losing it.
It's been a really, really long time since I played it. So
I think I lost it because I know that you get a letter that you from. Who do you get the flower from? I don't know. I lost. I think the bear gives you flower. You give the flower to a goat. You give she gives you a letter. No, yeah, who goes to Mr. Right, who I think gives you a pineapple, who you give to the guy who knocked the hornet thing out of the nest, who gives you a fish. No, I missed a broom. Okay, sorry. This was an entirely pointless aside. I've just done this so many times. I missed the broom, which gives you the hook, which. Oh no, but because that's later. I sound like a crazy person right now.
Well, to be fair, I mean, you are.
Yeah, whatever. Thank you for your support. But anyways, the trading quest in and of itself, so the trading quest, what I'm trying to get at here, was integral to the game. You could not beat the game without finishing up this trading quest. Because at the end of it, it gave you a magnifying glass. You had to use that magnifying glass to figure out what the path through the final dungeon was, which could only generously be called a dungeon. Because it was just a dark room, a dark maze where you had to follow the directions and you dropped in the final boss. As you progressed through the game, there were so many unique new little touches. So there was a shop in town, one of the only places you could spend rupees. Now, what was unique about this place was you could make the shopkeeper turn around and book it out. And he warned you, if you ever tried to run out of the shop with the item, don't do that, there'll be a price to pay. And if you do that and go back in, he says, I told you would pay the price, and he kills you instantly. Which, some of those items are expensive. I kind of thought that it was a decent trade-off, personally.
But you only get one.
No, you can get all of them. Like, you can, at the beginning of the game, you can steal the shovel, which I believe is 300 rupees, and then you can immediately steal the bow, which is 980 rupees. Now, that sounds like a lot, but this is a kind of game where you can open up a chest and get 300 rupees out of it. It doesn't happen a lot, but the way the game's staggered, you get the bow by the time you're supposed to have the bow. Anyways, as you're progressing through these dungeons, you keep collecting instruments. And what you're finding as you continue progressing is that the instruments are crucial to waking the windfish. This is an unusual thing because there's an egg sitting on top of a mountain that supposedly has the windfish. Now, I'm glossing over an enormous amount. Was it a mountain
or was it a volcano?
It's called Tall Tall Heights was something else. I thought it was located in Tall Tall Heights. It looks like it'd be a volcano because it comes up to a peak, but I don't think
right, and then the egg is sitting on top of it. This is a huge egg, in case you haven't figured it out.
It is a very, very large egg. The game has really memorable characters. Like Marin, she's not just a Zelda XP. She wants to get off the island. She's really big into singing. She's questioning why nobody's ever been off the island. All they ever know is this island.
Well, and this is the first game that we have no Zelda, no Triforce.
However, there was a collectible called a Piece of Power, I believe, that powered up your sword for a limited amount of time that was straight up an upside down glowing triangle. So
yeah, that's not a Triforce.
It is not a Triforce.
Maybe it's technically related to the other Triforce.
That's neither here. We'll get to that. But
Another talk.
This game, I really loved it. I loved the portability of it. I loved how all the dungeons, there was usually some little fun thing associated with getting to them. In the first one, you had to save a guy who turned into a raccoon. In the second one, you had to save the dog, which allowed you to get into the dungeon. In the third one, you had to go collect 5 golden leaves. This is an interesting bit of trivia. You had to collect 5 golden leaves from a dungeon, palace, that a guy got kicked out of, but he was actually a character from one of Nintendo's games they didn't release in America, like something Frog Prince. It was really interesting. I didn't know that till years later. So, and then in the 4th one, this is where it starts to get a little fuzzy with me. You have to go to the animal village, actually, to get the key. So that's where you learn there's an animal village. The 5th one, you have to put a ghost to rest. The 6th one, you start finding out that the island exists on the islet of the windfish. So then your little owl friend who occasionally shows up says, yeah, if you wake up the windfish, the whole world's going to disappear. Or maybe not. Nobody's ever done it. And as a child, this blew my mind. I mean, it was really...
Because it's relatively vague about what's really going to happen.
Mm-hmm. It was real, well, is this a good moral thing? I mean, it's almost a moral choice, except for the fact it's a Game Boy game and you don't have a choice. Either you don't beat the game or you do. And for the 7th one, you have to find Wart from Super Mario Bros. 2 and have him teach you a song that'll wake up a skeleton rooster who can fly around. And for the 8th dungeon, you have to... I don't even remember. I think you just got to cross the mountains. I don't think there's anything special about that. But there's always something that makes it fun getting to the dungeon, but not tedious, like in Skyward Sword, where everything was just a boring puzzle and it is not as enjoyable. Now, this could be rose-tinted glasses, too, because I played this game in grade school, then again in middle school, high school, college, post-college.
But usually with rose-tinted glasses, you go back and you look at something again, and afterwards you're like, oh, wow, yeah, okay, that... My remembrance of it is rose-tinted, but my actuality now is not. Like, for instance, me with Voltron. I cannot watch the original Voltron for nothing, though I loved it dearly as a child.
This game doesn't have that. I've replayed it somewhat recently, and it's still super fun. I love Link's Awakening. I love the fact that they have like a nested dream within a dream thing. To get the ocarina, which I didn't know was a musical instrument when I was a kid. I thought it was a weird nose. And it made no sense to me. But you get the ocarina, and even that's an inspiration from Link to the Past, because you get the ocarina from the
boy in the woods.
Flute boy is what they call him. And you get the hook shot in this game. You get the fire rod. This game was put together really, really well. And in the DX version, they even added more functionality. They added a photographer who would take pictures of you at certain key moments. It wasn't possible to get all of the photos in one playthrough because of how it was set up. In one of them, if you don't stand still to take a picture with Marin, I think, she'll end up beating you up. So it's a really, really good game, and I loved it to death.
Well, and if I remember correctly, the DX version where they added in that photographer, if you happen to have one of the Game Boy printers, you can print those pictures out.
Yeah. That game was so... And I have that game downloaded on my 3DS, and I might actually go back and play it after this.
And who in the world has a Game Boy printer?
I did see a funny thing the other day. Taking selfies used to be way harder back in the day. It had the Game Boy camera, and it had the little printout. I just thought that was the funniest thing. But because we are covering so much this episode, do you have anything else on Link's Awakening? Because at the end of the game, when you go to confront the nightmare, this is really cool because it directly references previous games. It cycles through a bunch of different bosses from previous games. You've got the squiggly worm whose name somehow not a Goma. It's not, no, because that's the spider.
I can never remember the actual name.
But you know what I'm talking about. It does that. You fight Aghanim, a version of Aghanim from Link to the Past. You fight a version of Ganon from Link to the Past. And then you fight the nightmare itself. The nightmare is what kept the windfish from waking up. When you wake up the windfish, you do eradicate the whole island. But if you don't die, you see, in the original version, you see Marin fly across the end screen with wings. And in the deluxe version, it actually shows a picture of Marin singing before it morphs into a seagull.
Right. And well, and if I remember correctly, you destroy the world by waking up the windfish because the world was his dream.
Yes. So, I don't know. I like the idea. I thought it was super clever, but I'm obviously...
It's a little bit of out of step with some of the other Zelda games, but it's just because of it being their first attempt at a mobile.
It was, but I don't think.
And it was good. It wasn't, that didn't detract from it in any way, but you can see whereas it's just different.
Mm-hmm. So we cool on this one?
Yep.
Okay, last note on that one is to get the swords that you had to collect the secret seashells. I thought that was a great way of upgrading the sword, finding collectibles. There was more than 20 of them. You only needed 20 to get the upgraded sword. Yeah. And I loved everything about this game. I might actually play it again after this podcast. From there, we're going to talk about the Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages games that originally released for Game Boy Color. However, it was so close to the tail end of the Game Boy Color that they were worried that the Game Boy Advance would keep it from selling well. The Game Boy Advance later got delayed, so they released it without problem, but included some functionality that would only be unlocked if you played on a Game Boy Advance. Specifically, there were shops that would open up.
Right. In fact, they wanted to put that in originally and were afraid that they couldn't get it done in time for the Game Boy release. And then when that got delayed, they were like, oh, we can do this. And then they pushed it in there real quick.
Now, there's a couple very interesting points of backstory here. And one of them you brought to light was that this was originally intended to start as a reimagining of the original Zelda game, correct?
Right. It was supposed to be, well, a reimagining of the first two games,
right,
with a third one strapped in there, and they were all going to be intertwined.
So the idea originally was if you started any one game, it would then, if you put a password in, it would continue to the second game, which would give you a password and continue to the third game.
Originally, they were apparently intended to be kind of played at the same time. I'm using air quotes here. So that you could do things in one, put it in another, get something out of it, play it for a little while, get something out of that one, play that, put that into the third game, and just keep doing that kind of around. So that they would all influence each other. You could play them all the way through and get stuff out of one, put them in the second one, but you didn't have any specific order you had to do it.
Now, they kind of had that,
right,
sort of.
But what they ran into was the
3-game combination was way too complex given the limitation of the technology, because math tells you that if you have 3 possible things, you have 6 total paths.
Right.
And given the limitation of the technology, they could not figure out a good way to implement this.
Right.
So Miyamoto goes, cut a game. So sadly, Seed of Courage never saw the light of day.
Unfortunately, no. And it was, they had different ways they could kind of do these things, but how do you handle having 3 games and 1 Game Boy to transfer over to? You could try passwords, but that gets complicated in and of itself.
Well, passwords is what I would have recommended. They also had the ability to use link cables, so you could use that.
Which you can use to do some of the power rings in the games, but
yes,
that's, in and of itself, you have to have 2.
That was always a problem. There were other games that did a similar gimmick. This was the one that most notable to me. I'm sure there's other prominent games, but anyways, so these games, the thing about them was Oracle of Seasons was primarily action-focused and Ages was puzzle-focused. Now, I love Seasons was the one I played first, and they were released simultaneously. The idea after one of them got cut was either one can be the first game. So you can play Seasons first, take your password, put it into Ages, and it will play the game as if you beat Seasons first. It'll reference stuff from the first game. Characters will talk to you differently. For example, when you encounter Impa in the forest, she doesn't act like you've just come from a new land. She goes, oh yeah, thanks for helping out so much in Seasons. We're here now doing this thing. What was really curious to me was later, so I beat these games front to back to front, inside, outside, upside down. I beat it Seasons, Ages, Ages, Seasons. Then when you beat the games, because spoiler alert, Ganon's the real bad guy.
What a surprise.
This is actually pretty clever, though. So you can tell that these games were made after Ocarina of Time, because the real big bad, and this was something I enjoyed, the real big bad is the Twinrova sisters from Ocarina of Time. They are facilitating the bad things that happen in both of these games to try and bring Ganon back. And you never played these games, did you?
Unfortunately not.
They're so good. You should play these games. So good. And what happens is, in Seasons, I can't remember which one's Destruction and which one's Despair. I think Destruction is Seasons. they're trying to light 3 flame. No, I'm getting them mixed up. Disregard whatever names of flames they are. So when you finish up Oracle of Seasons, they say the red flame has been lit. When you beat Ages, the blue flame has been lit. And then at that point, Twinrova kidnaps Zelda with the intent of lighting the 3rd flame. But since the 3rd flame is not lit appropriately, when they bring Ganon back, he's more like a big raging bear than an actual person because they messed it up. But I am getting way too far ahead of myself at this point.
Yeah, so generally it's considered you play Seasons first and then you play Ages.
Now, see, when I've played them, Seasons plays better as the second game. A lot more stuff carries over when you play Ages first. That's my experience. So that's how I recommend it to people, even though I love Seasons more. Seasons is my jam. So in Seasons, the reason it's called that is because the Oracle of Seasons, Din, who Zelda enthusiasts would know that Din is the goddess of power. When she gets kidnapped by this general, the Seasons go crazy because, gasp, she was the Oracle of Seasons. And you have to go to a underground kingdom to get the Rod of Seasons. You have to go down there. Subrosia.
Right.
A bunch of little cloaked people who are awesome, and I'm super sad they've never brought them back. Because there's a little subworld underground. Like, you can teleport between the above world and below world.
Right.
And it's done really clever where sometimes if you don't know where to go, you go to Subrosia. They had mini games down there. They had their own shop. They had a different form of currency. There was a lot of really cool little details about Subrosia. And at one point, you had a semi-dating game. You had to court a popular female Subrosian because she had a locket that allowed you to unlock any door in Subrosia. And you had to unlock some doors to get the season that you needed. Because the Temple of Seasons, after the Oracle of Seasons was captured, the Temple of Seasons was dropped into Subrosia, so all the seasons would go crazy and whatever kingdom that was would disintegrate. That was the guy's plan. So you have to go get the Rod of Seasons, which allows you to cycle through the different seasons.
Right.
And as you progress through the game, you get all 4 of them. And
well, in order to upgrade, you have to get the 8 essences of nature.
Well, that's what you're trying to collect in the game. That's like your thing. They're necessary in the same regards of you can't continue to progress through the game if you don't beat the dungeons.
Right.
And I don't know what about that game I'm so fond of. I really like the characters that reference old, like, I think in Seasons, but it could be Ages. The windmill guy from Ocarina of Time is there. And they bring back the trading quest, but again, actually this time, it is entirely optional because what the trading quest does in these 2 games is upgrade your sword. Now, it's optional to a point because if you don't have the Master Sword, by the time you get to Ganon at the end of beating both games, you have to hit him with a charge attack. If you have the Master Sword, then you can just hit him. So what the benefit of playing these 2 games linked up was, when you play the second game, you'll talk to people who go, hey, do you happen... Oh, yeah, when you play the second game, the first game has the ability... I'm trying to remember how this goes because it was a decently complicated system.
Yeah, when you play the first game, when you beat it, you get a password.
You get a password.
And then upon creation of the
second
game, upon starting it, you put in that password. And that unlocks the people that ask you for passwords throughout the game.
But to get the passwords, you have to go back to the first game
and get them from.
And do little activities. And when you do the activities, then, and I could be getting this backwards. If I am, somebody correct me, please. But you do activities in the first game that they give you a password and it transfers over to the second game. So this is how you get things like the big round sword, bomb shoes, maybe a better shield. I'm not positive on that one, but definitely a higher level of sword. So you can get the original sword, then the second sword, and then the third one's the Master Sword, only capable of the Link system. And Oracle of Seasons, again, very highly focused on the action, blazing over this real fast because we're trying to fit 5 games into this episode.
Right.
the way they approach it, the seasons allowed for some real basic puzzles that were still nice. I liked them. You could also collect rings, which were entirely optional. Did you read about this?
Yeah.
So you collect. Do you collect materials to be turned into rings? I can't. Oh, you collect just random rings, unidentified rings, and you have to take them back to the appraiser, and they can potentially have an effect of upping your power, upping your defense, doing nothing, hobbling you if you're some kind of masochist. The rings, you could have different size ring boxes. I know a bigger ring box was one of the upgrades that could transfer from the games.
And to transfer rings, you had to have the link cable.
Are you positive on that?
Relatively certain.
Okay. I am not positive on that. And an interesting thing, a very interesting thing, when you connected these two games, you were given the sword from the get-go. You didn't have to go and to find the sword. What they did was the sword, like the beginning dungeon where you collected the sword, that got turned into a disgustingly difficult puzzle dungeon. Like, difficult to the point where I couldn't beat it when I got the game originally. Now, mind you, was I in middle school or early high school? So that was over a decade ago, and I'm sure they've aged to the point where they're a little easier. But an example would be they have a big grid that you have to turn all the tiles from yellow to red. However, because of the way it's set up via Dijkstra's algorithm or whatever, you cannot hit one square. So what you have to do, and this is the kind of out-of-the-box thinking they want, you have to use their cane that created blocks to cover that square with a red block. That's how you're supposed to beat it. That's the kind of puzzles we're looking at here.
That's creative.
It's super
annoying
creative.
Because you'll spend the entire time.
Mm-hmm. But I think we've about touched enough on seasons, just getting into ages real fast. They kidnap the Oracle, they possess the Oracle of Ages so they can go back in time and manipulate the events of the past.
Right.
So they can basically control everything.
Which ends up causing a kind of apocalyptic timeline that you end up in when you meet the Mako Tree, which the Mako Tree is actually in both games.
Yes.
As are the 8 essences of something.
Right. And the Mako Tree is kind of your hub. You go here and you work with them to try to figure out how to save the game you're working on. And when you go meet with this tree the first time, in the past, this bad guy had sent somebody to destroy the tree, and obviously since you never stopped it, it was destroyed. You go back in time, you save the tree. That basically sets the tone of how a lot of the puzzles in this game work. You have to often find yourself going back in time, fixing something so the present gets made better. However, it's not always necessarily just fixing. Sometimes it's little changes. I remember when there's one particular puzzle where you have to go back in time, shift a rock slightly, and when you go back to the present, it is now a big lake because you made that little shift in the past that's been filling up for the last 100 years. So this is the general kind of puzzles you can expect. Now, there are 3 songs you can learn to manipulate time. There is the Song of Portals, which will only open up time portals, so you have fixed points where you can jump back and forth through time. The Song of Currents, which will bring you from the past to the present, and then just the Song of Time, I think the third one is. I could be wrong on that. And it just lets you teleport between the past and present whenever. This game also has a lot of interesting characters, but not as interesting to me as the Subrogians. I know I'm really focusing on those, but you have the Zoras in this game, which is interesting because you have to go back in time to save the Zora King, because the Zoras don't have a king because in the past the ocean was polluted, so you have to go and unpollute the ocean. So in the future,
so they can survive.
Right. And you're the savior of the Zoras then when you go into the present because you saved them those many years ago. It's really clever, and it's grown on me a lot as I've gotten older. I didn't like the antagonist as much. I didn't like the palette, but you can see from the level design and the boss design and just some of the characters, the fondness. A lot of this feels like an homage to earlier games, which it's supposed to be.
Kind of really is.
Right.
And on top of that, this is probably the only real instance where we had a simultaneous release
Yes.
of two games. They were released at the same time. It wasn't like a staggered release where they were like, oh, this one's out and then this one's out 6 months later. They released both at the same time, kind of like Pokemon started doing with their red and blue and their,
And they originally planned on staggering these releases. And in fact,
when it was going to be 3 games, they expected it to.
They also released dual packs some places that came with both games because they were companion games. You were fully intended to play these games together.
Right.
And this is another one where I wouldn't love to say that it's rose-colored glasses because I've gone back and I've played these countless times. Many times. The only thing that I can potentially down on them for is the water dungeon in Ages is a little obtuse. But is that really all I got?
If that's the worst that you can come up with, they're pretty good games.
I love them. I do. And apparently they sold like gangbusters. Nobody I knew ever really played them. But apparently they were a critical and commercial success, which really makes me happy.
Which is, again, another showing that this was... These games were flagship.
Right.
They were officially flagship, which was a subsidiary of Capcom. And, again, they did a fantastic job with it.
And I love them to death, and I cannot talk them up more. And you can tell the fondness. You can tell how well everything was implemented. It had great mini games. I enjoyed the music. I really can't think of much bad to say about these games. I'm sure somebody can, and if you can, chime in. I would love to hear your opinion. But on that note, I think we're good to move to Phantom Hourglass. At first, I kept saying Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks like they were bunched together, but that's not fair because this is an Oracle of Ages and Seasons. These were 2 different games.
Yeah, they were separate. They weren't designed at the same time.
Right.
They weren't intended to be connected exactly.
So Phantom Hourglass is an interesting game because it is a direct sequel to Wind Waker.
Right.
And
on the DS.
On the DS.
Yeah.
And at first, there was a little trepidation, both from myself and people I knew, from the way it controlled, because you controlled it solely with the bottom touchscreen, and you moved around on the top one. I could be wrong there. It's been a long time since I played it.
But that would make sense, because that was the whole gimmick about the DS, was that you had one touchscreen and then one bigger screen on top.
Right. The big thing about this game, so in this game, while you and Tetra, Link and Tetra, are out on the open ocean, you encounter a ghost ship. Tetra tries to board it, immediately calls for help. Long story short, you gotta save Tetra. And I looked up the plot before we went on air. The plot is so much more involved than I remembered it being.
Yeah, it's huge.
So, go ahead.
So you get transported to an island, effectively, and you end up meeting...
Linebeck. First you meet the fairy.
First you meet Oshus and Ciela.
Oh, right. Ciela's the fairy. Oshus is an old man.
Well, Oshus is an old man and grandpa to Ciela. That's what she calls him.
Got it.
You find out that she's the fairy of, what was it, power, I think?
Yeah.
The fairy of courage. Later on, because she, like the king of the ocean, could split her body into a clone. And so when the fairies were being trapped, she had split her consciousness off to another body who didn't remember that she was the fairy. It's really quite complicated.
Well, and I remember the idea behind it was you were originally trying to collect the fairies so that way you could...
You were trying to get...
to save Tetra?
To save Tetra from a new bad guy named Bellum.
Bellum. Now, Bellum, I'm going to talk about this at length, maybe in a mini-sode, maybe in 3D. The Zelda games could really benefit from a bad guy who wasn't Ganon. However, they really need to try to develop them. Vati, they tried to develop. We talked about Vati extensively.
Right.
But Bellum is never given any characterization. Bellum and the Temple of the Ocean King are the 2 things I could really fault in this game. Because the Temple of the Ocean King, you had to continue going into it and going a little lower after every dungeon.
So the trick about the dungeons in this particular game was you could only be in them for a little while, and it would drain your hit points.
So that was the Temple of the Ocean King specifically. That was the big thing. Was you had so much time in the dungeon, and that was dictated by your phantom hourglass. So you were trying to get
which gave you more time. You could go in there without it, but it sapped you real quick.
Right, it killed you real fast. You were going further down in the dungeon to get ocean charts, and the ocean charts allowed you to find new. I know you were looking for fairies, and then once you got all the fairies, I think you rescued Zelda at that point. Tetra. So, potato. And once you rescued Tetra, you found out that, oh wait, this is actually a bad guy named Bellum. And at this point, I believe Oshus tells you you need to make a super awesome sword.
Right, the Phantom Sword.
The Phantom
Sword.
So
a new sword on top of the Master Sword and the Forest Sword / White Sword.
And this is just a one-off sword, though, because you never see this again.
Yet.
Yet. Well, and I don't think we will based on the next game. But anyways, so you go through and you put the sword together. You go to the bottom of the Temple of the Ocean King. You defeat Bellum, quote unquote defeat. While you're escaping, Bellum attaches to Linebeck, and you have to fight Linebeck.
Linebeck somehow sacrifices himself in order to throw you the Phantom Sword for some reason. You get the Phantom Sword. You defeat Bellum.
Right.
And then
when you wake up, like it was all a dream because apparently you only got onto the boat 10 minutes ago.
Right.
From the beginning. But then you see Linebeck ride off. Oh, it wasn't really a dream, So it might sound like I'm being a little dismissive. I really enjoyed this game at the time. And I think I would enjoy it again now. One of the things it did originally that I loved to death was the fact it gave you manual control over how your ship was navigating. You drew on the DS the route you wanted your ship to take, and while your ship was going that route, you could attack stuff. So compared to Wind Waker, this was like night and day. This was amazing. So I really liked how they implemented travel in this game. And in addition to that, maybe it's just because it appealed to who I am, but you could also upgrade parts of your ship. So you could upgrade the hull, the engine, the cannon, and I feel like there was something else.
And this is, if I remember correctly, this was actually the SS Lineback.
Yes.
That you were doing this on.
Right. And that is important for the next game. But Linebeck was developed as originally just a money-grubbing dude, and when he gave his life to, save Link at the end, this was a really selfless thing. Linebeck was a good guy, and I'm bummed we haven't seen more of him. However, it'd be very difficult to see more of him.
Did we mention that this is a direct sequel to Wind Waker?
Very beginning.
Did we? Okay.
Very beginning. And you're still looking for new land. I liked it. There were some problems it had. DS had some functionality that I would generously call gimmicky. So it had the microphone was the worst offender. I think. Did it also have? No, it didn't have a gyroscope.
No.
That was the 3DS.
Yeah.
But there were certain times where it told you to yell real loud into your microphone to reduce the price of something. And then,
because the last thing you want to do when you're out in public is start yelling at your handheld.
Right. I had a buddy who apparently was on a bus, and he was just sitting there, ah! And then afterwards, because this is the kind of game it was, it goes, you didn't yell, did you? You could just snap in front of the microphone, and that would really, game? Awesome. Now, the one that really got me, where I thought it was really clever, was there was an upside down. They say, oh, yeah, look, here's the chart. But how in the world are we going to copy it over? Like, what are we going to do here? So on your top screen, it showed the upside down chart. What you were supposed to do was close your DS.
Right.
And then when you opened it, it's like you pressed it on. I thought that was the coolest little thing.
Right, which is fun, innovative. I mean, well, you don't design an entire system just so you can do that one thing, but
right.
At least it was a good use of that particular gimmick.
Right. And I can't call it particularly innovative because it was the only time they used it. But I feel like the dungeon designs were decent, even though I don't really recall them. I played this my freshman year of college. That was...
Oh, so the fact that you remember anything about it at all is probably impressive.
Yeah, exactly. My memory's going in my young age. I enjoyed it. I can't really say much more about it. I know there was a fishing mini game that I beat to completion because I guess it was strong enough that I beat it all the way. I pulled up a big old fish. It was fun. And I really liked how it continued on the story, but it didn't do it in such a way that it felt it was heavy-handed. It didn't really touch on the previous story at all. You didn't hear about Link's grandma, Link's sister. You didn't hear really anything about Hyrule, Ganon. But it was the same characters with the same personality. So I enjoyed it.
So they just got on with their life and
pretty much. I mean, they were going to find a new Hyrule. That was kind of what they were setting out to do at the end of the game, and that they did it. So this was a game you never played, correct?
Correct.
And that was because you were dirt poor, was it?
Yes.
Okay.
Did not have a GBA, did not have a DS. I do have a 3DS.
And I think it's also been brought over to the Wii U Virtual Console.
That would surprise me, but I don't own a Wii U because only like 5 people own a Wii U. So
yeah, well,
one of them sits in front of me at this moment.
About to say 3 out of 5 of them are regulars on this podcast. So, anyways, I think we're about good on this one. We talked about the benefits it brought. I think it sold well. Let me look up real fast. I know it got crazy good reception. Like, people love this game. I remember really liking it as well. As far as sales go, do you happen to recall how well it sold?
I don't. I'm sure it was pretty decent for a DS game.
Yeah, for a handheld, probably. And I really liked it. There's really no other ways around it. Some people complained it was too easy, but I'm not playing Bloodborne over here. It's whatever.
It's a Zelda game. It's supposed to be accessible to everyone.
Accessible. Anyways, we'll take this opportunity to switch over to Spirit Tracks, which is yet another interesting case because can you name anywhere else where there have been 3 direct sequels? Wind Waker was followed by the direct Phantom Hourglass, which then was followed by the direct Spirit Tracks. It was set 100 years after Phantom Hourglass, but it was
a sequel to that line.
Yes.
And no, I don't think.
Nope. Nothing else. Yeah.
Wind Waker, Phantom Hourglass, and Spirit Tracks are direct in the same timeline. In fact, the split happens, then you get Wind Waker, and they're their own timeline altogether.
Right. Well, wait, that's the adult timeline?
Yes.
Okay. Anyways, I almost got into talking about Wind Waker there for a second. That's not here nor there. So other games, while they may be in the same timeline, like Majora's Mask goes into Twilight Princess, and then on the timelines followed by Four Swords Adventures.
They were not released consecutively.
They were not released consecutively, nor were they directly planned that way. So Spirit Tracks picks up 100 years after Phantom Hourglass. You're on a new continent of Hyrule, and this always baffled me when I played it. This was near the tail end of my college experience. Somehow in 100 years, there's enough of an infrastructure that becoming an engineer is a royal honor. I'm really not sure how that works. It's actually explained a little bit in that the Spirit Tracks, you find out, were used to help contain a demon called Maladius or Maladius.
Yeah,
it's one of those two.
But yeah, they're kind of like almost spiritual chains,
right,
locking him into place.
And due to the meddling of a particularly nefarious-looking official, the chains have been slowly going away. And by the time the game starts up, they're almost all gone. While you go to become an engineer, Zelda gets jumped. At this point, she's straight up Zelda. She's no longer Tetra. Right. She gets jumped and she gets knocked out of her body, and it's because her body is needed to be possessed by the Demon King. And they really need to have more consistent villains. I'm not hating on them because there was a reason they did this, but we've never heard of Maladius. I mean, could he be related to Bellum in any sense?
Maybe, but they didn't flesh that out.
They did not flesh that out. And I was a little salty because after the freedom of Phantom Hourglass, Spirit Tracks didn't have it. You were confined
to you're stuck on the tracks themselves.
Right. And To even more constrict this, and Nick shared this sentiment with me, there are demon trains or bomb trains. They look like bombs, but they may have called them demons. If you run into them, it's instant game over. So why are you even doing this? Like, why don't they just essentially teleport you there? There are some gorgeous set pieces at times because you can imagine in a cell shaded world, the idea of riding on this train sounds like it could be really cool, and it can be really cool. But it's so restrictive that it kind of made me angry at the game. However, when Zelda's soul gets knocked out of her body, her soul, you continue to perceive it. And this was brought up very tangentially. Have you listened to the podcast about females in video games?
I have not, and
Okay.
I need to.
And, well, obviously, catch up on co-opinions on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, all your popular options,
Do.
right?
Ads by Josh.
Heyo. And we talked about how in this game, Zelda was actually one of the strongest incarnations we had seen up to that point because she actively provides assistance the entire game. What can happen in dungeons is when you collect enough Pearls of Light, I think it was called, which is how you can tell this game came after Twilight Princess, because they had those in Twilight Princess, and then you attack a phantom, which looks like a dark nut in the back, it allows Zelda to possess that character. You can then switch between Link and the Phantom to complete puzzles. And using this mechanic, you have to bring the spirit tracks back to the world. I'll be 100% honest with you. I looked up the plot before we came on, but this is a very long plot, much, much longer than I recall. I remember you have to put the spirit tracks back together, then for some reason you get a sword called the Locomo Sword. Is any of this ringing a bell?
Nope.
So you put it back together, you put all the spirit tracks back together, somehow Maladius still gets out, possesses Zelda, you have a train battle, which sounds awesome, but it's not. And I'm glossing over so much of this game, it's not funny,
Right.
but I don't recall a lot of it. And to me, do you want to consider that I don't personally consider it a weakness in the game because we are talking about over the course of these 4 episodes, not 8, 11, 13 games. Not every game can be super memorable. I remember what I consider to be the important things, which apparently is not much. As far as my opinion compared to everybody else's opinion, this game still got very high reviews. It did have gorgeous visuals, gorgeous music. Zelda was stronger than ever. In fact, she was almost arguably the main character in this game. You were just kind of helping her along. But I didn't find Link to be that engaging of a character. And we will touch back on something similar to this when I talk about Twilight Princess many moons from now, because this game felt more like this actually felt like The Legend of Zelda O plus Link. Just like Twilight Princess really shouldn't have been called Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, should have been called Twilight Princess, and also Link is there. Anyways.
Twilight Princess Legend of Link.
Yeah, well, there was no legend. He was just a farm boy. Anyway, I will get into that at length when we have that episode, which I don't think you'll be on, so you'll have to listen in. On iTunes, Google Play, wherever you may get your podcasts.
Really, we're doing this again?
Do. Anyways, I don't want to be too hard on Spirit Tracks because I feel like I enjoyed it.
You enjoyed it, but it's not necessarily the strongest of them all.
I would say out of all the portable ones we've talked about, this is the weakest portable game for me.
With the exception of Force Sword.
I barely count that. Just like I'm going to tear Triforce Heroes a new beehole.
Oh, we haven't talked about that one yet.
Oh, okay. So I wouldn't consider Force Swords. And Minish Cap was a strong game. I just went through it so fast I recall very little about it.
Speaking of Minish Cap, real quick, I actually forgot to mention this. Apparently, there was a European, like a raffle almost, where they had a special where you could get it was a golden, kind of like the 3DS special for Link Between Worlds. They had one of those for the Advance SP. So it was
with the
gold
little-
colored with the little Triforce on it.
Yeah.
And in 8 of the boxes, there was also a golden ticket. And if you got the golden ticket, you got a 24 karat gold version of the same Advance SP.
Wow. But you didn't get to go inside the chocolate factory.
You did not get to go into this chocolate factory.
I think it's a pretty decent trade-off.
I'd rather have the 24 karat gold Advanced SP.
That's a pretty cool SP. Well, thank you for that little bit of trivia. So, Spirit Tracks did a lot that was decent in terms of progressing Zelda as an independent character. Prior to this, we had seen her as an independent character. Tetra, very strong. Unusually weak in the follow-up due to circumstance. In Twilight Princess, Zelda was very strong. But in this game, she was both the princess and constantly active. This was a good combination for her. To me, personally, the biggest strength of Spirit Tracks was her usage.
Right. Well, and she was something more than just, please, rescue me.
She is not a damsel in distress, even though they had been working to break her out of that role. Anyways, is there anything else you would like to add on Spirit Tracks?
On Spirit Tracks specifically? No.
Okay. So I think that I'm about tapped on Spirit Tracks as well. And on that note, I think we've about used up all of our time for this particular episode. We still got one left. Come back for the thrilling, possibly very short conclusion next episode where we talk about Link Between Worlds and Triforce Heroes. Not much about Triforce
I was about to
Heroes.
say, I'm going to go ahead and just go on the record of saying, let's start with Triforce Heroes, just so we can eviscerate
We cannot. We cannot. Because Triforce Heroes is a direct sequel.
I know.
We can't. And we can't. We can't. So, if you don't have anything else, yeah?
Nope, I'm good.
Wonderful. So, in that case, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Jake, thank you again for coming on.
You're welcome.
If you have any opinions about what you thought about Link's Awakening, DX, how'd you like the Oracle games? What did I mess up on Spirit Tracks? What about Phantom Hourglass really called to you? Go online, let us know your opinions. I would love to hear from you. But until next time, this is Co Opinions.